Hi, I'm Rodolfo Mendoza-Denton, a psychology professor at UC Berkeley and your host for Wellness at Berkeley and Introduction. My co-host is Dree Kavoussi, ASUC Senator and fourth-year undergraduate. Today's topic, we tackle sexual violence. Joining me today are Paula Flamm, Social Services Manager at UC Berkeley, Tobirus Newby, Clinical Social Worker, University Health Services Tang Center, and Knuth-Bouracee, Director of Sexual Assault Prevention and Student Advocacy at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your time and wisdom. Let's get started.
So a lot of incoming students to Cal have never even heard of things like sexual violence or sexual assault. Can y'all define what those terms are used for?
I'm really glad you started with that because I think there's often a misconception when someone hears the word sexual violence as it being a fairly narrow concept. It really is a broad term, and it can be something that includes contact, but it also includes non-contact. So for instance, an example of something that would be a non-contact would be somebody receiving pornography showing up in their inbox on their computer, or somebody's photos that were taken in privacy being posted to the internet. And then when we talk about contact, it can be something as contact through the clothing of somebody grabbing a body part all the way to penetration and rape. So there's a broad range of what it entails.
And one thing also brought up related to sexual violence is the impact that it has on a survivor. Because sometimes a person who perpetrates violence might not have intended to harm the person, but it's really important to check in with the impact that it has on the person.
And I think the last piece that I would add is, believe it or not, many students have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime, or also have a family member or somebody they care about at home. So though this often comes up within the context of our college campus, it's also an experience that folks are having beyond the walls of the university.
And for students here, how does sexual violence happen at UC Berkeley?
So, unfortunately, it's too often an experience that some of our students face. And there can be a lot of stories that we're told about how this is perpetrated, right? And so sometimes it's the idea that there's a stranger that might come up to someone and hurt them, and somebody they don't know. That happens, right? But also what I think is less commonly talked about is when it's somebody that we love, maybe our partner or a family member, or somebody that we have class with, that we went to a party with. And so, it could be at home, two folks engaging in activity, and one person doesn't have the consent of the other person to move forward, or it could be at a party. And
it may start as something that is consensual, where somebody is at a party and they're attracted and they're dancing and they're engaging, and then it speeds up and it moves too fast, and pressure starts to come into the situation, or somebody doesn't know how to disengage or to slow things down.
And in most of the cases, or I could dare say all the cases of supporting survivors that I've been able to do on campus, there's often this sense after the incident that something was not right about that. Sometimes it's overt. They're like, no, that definitely was not right. That was definitely violence. That was definitely assault. But then there's other times where there's just really this question, this instinctual feeling that I don't know what it was, but something was not right about that. And so I think that represents the continuum of how it happens, that sometimes it's not clear.
Can I just ask for a quick point of clarification, Tobirus? This feeling of something not being right, is that shared as an experience during an event or afterwards in recollection of an event, or both?
That's a good question. I think it is both. Sometimes a person can communicate that in the middle of an incident or an experience, and then sometimes it takes a while for them to process and to think through what happened. And sometimes they don't recognize that until they talk to a friend and say, this happened last night, can we talk through that? And the friend's like, oh no, that's something really wrong happened there. So I think it can be both.
What is the root cause of sexual and intimate partner violence?
So I think that there's out in the world a lot of misconceptions of reasons why people perpetrate. And I think for me, you know, one of the pieces that's really important is often power, control, entitlement are reasons or causes that allow someone to take action toward or against another person without caring for that person's full humanity and who they are as a person.
Absolutely. And power and control definitely intersects with a lot of other systems of oppression, you know, whether it's related to race, related to gender, related to class. And so I think looking at the umbrella of power control is so important, and then also looking at how does that show up for specific communities and in specific situations. You know?
And what is the prevalence of sexual violence at UC Berkeley?
You know, there's not perfect data about violence at UC Berkeley. I think what comes to my mind is that violence is far more common than, you know, I think most of us learn about growing up. Most of us have a friend, a family member, or we ourselves have been survivors of sexual violence. So I tell folks, you know, if you're in a room with 10 people, there's probably a couple of folks in there that have experienced violence. And so basically any space that we're in, we want to be really thoughtful and mindful of our colleagues.
What kinds of actions and behaviors contribute to violence? So when you talk about violence.
Well, I can just jump in, and if we relate back to the idea of power and control and how it shows up, I mean, any structures, systems, institutions, and even cultural manifestations that reinforce that power and control, you know, and I think when we think about gender specifically, we can think about a history of patriarchy, and we can think about how that shows up to make a certain group feel entitled to certain things, you know? And so I think that's one avenue that you go down to think about how it happens.
And I think when people have experienced being silenced in their lives, they don't stand up for other people, and they don't, and they let things happen. They may see things, but not intervene. And so that's one of the things we're trying to change on college campuses, is having people be more proactive and step in and learn how to make change and help the community change.
Yeah.
Right. Can I ask a question? I noticed that when you were giving your definition of sexual violence, as well as the reasons why it happened, we talked about power, we talked about entitlement, we talked about control, but you mentioned something about humanity, to which you said, well said. Can you elaborate on this point about humanity?
I think that sometimes people get so caught up in themselves, and they don't realize about the impact of their actions on others. It's all about what they're wanting in that moment, and they may not be meaning to hurt somebody else, but they forget there's another person that they are impacting by what they're doing, and I think that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Thank you. That there's and your actions impact another individual, and I think your points also bring up of not just individuals, but broader social circles, if not entire communities.
Absolutely. And one thing I think that's so important about what we're doing here is that, you know, people coming to this campus come from all different types of situations where things might be normalized. But conversations like this really inform people of a different way to look at engaging with people and reinforce it for Cal's community. We are really, you know, taking a no acceptance of sexual violence. We're really working in that direction to help people to understand that in this community, if they want to be a part of it, we need to really honor and respect each other and our boundaries.
Culture shift.
Can be.
And you know, I think Tobirus was talking about these larger systems, and I think it's really important to try and see some really concrete examples of that so that we know when those systems are taking place. And so I think about, like, when a friend makes a sexist joke or a racist joke, anything that sort of belittles someone, their identity, their community, that is demeaning, is the start of violence, right? So if we stop that joke, that person won't have permission anymore to make those kinds of comments in the future. The opposite of that is also true, right? If we let that joke happen, maybe next time that person's gonna grab somebody's body part, right? Or maybe shove them or push them or bully them in some other way. And again, if that's permitted, then they're gonna take that violence potentially one step further, right? So the earlier that we can stop harm, the more likely that we'll have a safer community.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and y'all are true. So what I'm hearing a lot of too is it's this like mindset of, oh, this is the norm, this is the way it's always been, and if we kind of squelch that notion and really change that point of view, we can make huge major changes for the future. And that's really
So
really
we're talking about small ways in which we can unwittingly contribute to a culture of violence. For example, letting a mean joke go. Can you think of other examples for our viewers of ways in which, small ways in which we can contribute, and the alternative way to that is stop contributing to a culture of violence and contribute instead to a culture of consent?
Well, I think it definitely starts with, in my mind, I think it starts with what we're taking in, you know, what we're ingesting related to media, you know, even like social circles, like so it starts with a lot of internal reflection that then creates dialogue between our communities, you know, and community could be your two best friends, you know, or it could be a larger format. And when you see things happening, be willing to ask questions and say, I don't know if, you know, what do you mean by that? You know, something about that didn't sit right with me. Because it can often be easier to hear that from a friend or somebody you trust than a random person, you know, making that commentary. So I think really being committed to engaging in our own work around this and unpacking our own socialization. Because a lot of the work I've done and with men has required me to look at a lot of the ways I understand my masculinity. And so I think for all of us, a lot of internal reflection is important that creates dialogue between our community that, you know, continues to spread and manifest. So.
And when you say that comes first, because I know I've talked to students that say, you know, sometimes I'm really embarrassed to point out that what someone said was problematic. I don't want to be made fun of. Mentality like that, how do we shift that mentality that, you know?
Yeah, well, I think there could be a couple of things. One is if somebody you're with interrupts a joke like that or something mean or cruel that somebody else has said, affirm them for that. So let them know, hey, I'm really glad that you said that. I was thinking that too. So that could be one way to start. And then I think, you know, the concern of like, will people make fun of me, or, you know, will they have negative thoughts of me if I intervene? That's real, right? Folks have experienced bullying and harassment in their life. I get why they think that. And what I might say is it's worth intervening for the potential harm, right? So for me personally, I would be much happier to bring up to a colleague, hey, something that was said, I'm kind of uncomfortable with, can we talk it out? Or can you tell me more about what that means to you? What did you mean by that? And hope that I can stop that harm, then, you know, face, you know, whatever consequences I might have.
So we've covered so far the breadth of the term sexual violence, and a helpful reminder that it not only includes the things we prototypically might see as sexual violence, very direct aggressive acts, but rather also indirect acts or acts that don't involve contact, emailing pornography, for example. We've talked about a little bit about the prevalence, and we've talked about the kinds of situations where people might be at risk. Let's talk a little bit about consent in practice, although I did notice you wanted to say something.
I was going to say that I think if each person could take a look, do a little self-reflection and think about one thing that they would feel able to step up and try, that can lead to more action.
Thank you. So being prepared for that moment that might otherwise be a deer in the headlights kind of moment.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's great. That's great.
Yeah, well, to launch in, what is consent? You know, what is the definition to y'all?
Well, you know, I think it's such a large question and a large answer to it, but I think there are ways to break it down, which we can do right now. One thing I think one of the essences and the essential pieces of consent is being willing to ask before you take steps. You know, and then being able to wait to hear a response, and then respecting that response. And doing that at every step of your engagement with a person. So when you want to initiate, doing that in a way that allows a person to say, yep, yes, you can come talk to me. Yes, you can come dance with me. Then if you feel that there's chemistry, and people always talk about, oh, I just felt this feeling, or they were giving me the signs. If you just really pause your assumptions and say, hey, I think I'm feeling this, you know, are you feeling this too? Because often people can feel like they snap into this very sterile mindset when they talk about consent. But I think some of that internal reflection and like playing out, okay, what are some fun ways that I could say, hey, are you feeling this too, you know?
Yeah.
And then making sure that you check in as things progress. And then making sure that you check in the next day, even if something got to a certain point, and not assume that it's going to go there the next time you see a person. So it's really about having the courage to ask and having the courage to really respect what a person is telling you, and to give them the opportunity to willingly, openly, and enthusiastically engage with you.
And on a college campus, we have to remember that it also has to be given when somebody is able to give consent. So if someone's heavily under the influence, not drinking a little, but heavily under the influence, they may not be able to really give consent. Sometimes people are in a blackout and the next day are told what happened to them, and it feels like an incredible violation because they really don't remember what was going on. So I think both people need to be aware of just the state that somebody's in.
And what about, and I really hate to focus on the alcohol part because I know sexual violence occurs with or without alcohol, but since you brought it up, what if both parties are blacked out and, you know, the next day they're both told what happened? You know, what then?
So, you know, I think that's a common question that comes up. If somebody's at a party, maybe all the parties involved are drinking, how do we know who can give consent and who can't? So one thing that I might say is I understand why that question comes up, and that if folks did take a little reflection and took a little more caution, they would have clarity of, you know, should we be doing this? So I would first say that. I think alcohol gets brought into the conversation as a way to excuse behavior. And so I think we should first pause there. The second part is the person who's initiating behavior really needs to be the person that's figuring out, can this person give me consent, or are they incapacitated? And is their consent unambiguous and affirmative, right? And if you're not sure if somebody, you know, can give consent, one of the things I say is, if that person was going to a car dealership and they were gonna go purchase a car, would that car dealer salesperson say that they're in a state where they can consent, right? So consent actually happens every day, and we don't think about it. We often think about like this like unique bubble of consent around sex, but it's, you know, if I'm giving Tobirus a hug, I might say like, hey, you know, do you hug? And check in there. Or when we go make purchases or sign binding contracts, consent happens there. Or even if I like come over and ask, do you want water, to fill up your water? We're practicing that all the time, and we need to just translate those skills into other arenas of our life.
I have to say, I love that point because it normalizes this concept of consent that feels so, you know, outside of our social spheres, and yet something we practice every day.
So just to kind of wrap up, what role does alcohol play? You were saying that sometimes, you know, it can act as, I guess, like a social lubricant almost, where people think it's okay. What happens when alcohol is in the mix?
Well, I work with a lot of students related to alcohol and other drug concerns, and I think one thing that comes up all the time is that people really don't know how to just talk with others in a sober state. And people have a hard time imagining how to have fun in a sober or even just a less intoxicated state. And so I feel like that's some of the work that is being engaged in around consent too, is just helping people find the words to express what they want. And helping people to also understand their own boundaries, because sometimes we don't get a good sense of our boundaries until it's crossed and we're like, oh wait, that wasn't okay. So I think learning how to have better dialogue, even when you're sober, will really help to make better decisions about, you know, alcohol use.
And Dree, you've certainly highlighted the issue of alcohol and sexual violence, and we do know that there's a relationship there. And yet, sexual violence is not predicated on alcohol abuse or misuse. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think in college campuses, folks are eager to figure out, why is violence happening there? And so they try and look at what's different between a college campus and our neighborhood, right? And so parties is the first thing that people go to. But we know that there's all forms of abuse and violence that happen when alcohol isn't involved.
Is not involved.
Correct. Yeah. So I think it's important to know that sometimes alcohol is used as a weapon. It's used to sort of excuse and cover up behavior. But that's not the root of violence. We need to go back and figure out what allows one person to harm another person and to think that that's okay, or to not check in about consent or boundaries in the time that that's happening.
Which brings us back to the notion of power and entitlement and control, as well as the skills of talking to another person, and such an important skill to have. Let's move to the topic of bystander intervention, and I know that Dree has some questions prepared there.
Yeah, so as a Cal community, one, how do we create this culture of consent that y'all are talking about, this shift? And then two, what if we are a friend or someone watching an act about to take place? What can we do to be a cooperative community member and help our fellow friend out or stranger?
So I think the students are really running with this. They are going to the co-ops and they're having discussions about consent. They, even before parties, they're doing just a brief 5 minutes, what's consent, how do you get it, let's make sure we stay safe. So that's one way. The students are stepping in and they're running Cal Consent campaigns, and they're really talking about this issue. And so I think it's the students who are really going to change our culture. And talking with each other about how does one step in, and what's a way to divert if you see something going on that doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, or just going up and checking in. Do you want to be doing this right now? Should we go outside and take a little walk? So it doesn't have to be a big intervention. It can be a small step, and you can really avert a serious situation from happening.
I think earlier you brought up the point of how if people intervene when they shouldn't, what will their peers say to them, right? And so I might say, if, I think about, I had a student that said, their roommate was having sex and they weren't sure, if they could go in the room or, if what they saw was okay. And if nothing else, if you're checking in and you say, hey, everybody doing all right? If they're having a great time and it's all consensual activity, that will be a hilarious story that they will have at another point, right? Whereas if there was harm happening, then that would have gotten some support there. And as Paula said, I think the small interventions are okay. So I have a story of a student who was at a party and saw across the room and saw that there was a person who sort of had another person cornered, and didn't know, was that an okay way that they were talking? Was it maybe really loud, so they were trying to find privacy? And so she just went over and tapped the person on the back and said, hey, what's your major? And I know that sounds sort of silly, but it allowed that person to move and for that those people not to be in that sort of cornered situation. So it could really be anything. It could be coming up with a cup of water and saying, hey, do you want water? Or maybe it's a beer. Maybe you're coming and offering another beer or something.
Yeah, my friends and I do the dance technique, the thumbs up dance.
Great.
Right.
Wonderful.
So that's a really good one.
Yeah, it's a good one. You just blend it in.
Yep.
Yeah.
And in our conversations about bystander intervention and how to effectively intervene, one of the key strategies is distract. And that seems to me like it's a great example of that, where, hey, what's your major? It breaks the zoomed lens of that moment to be able to let people recover and think about their behavior going forward.
I'd like to just make a comment that's kind of a step before the actual scenario that you might find yourself in. I think if we get more comfortable just having conversations with our friends about, okay, what are you looking for tonight? What are your expectations? Talking about what can be our sign if something's going wrong. then you don't have to, then you feel confident going into the situation that, okay, we know what to do in this scenario, you know? So I think there's a combination of figuring out what you can do, but there's also a combination of, as a group, saying, all right, what are we looking for tonight? How are we feeling, you know? What can we do to support each other? And I think, you know, all groups should do that. It's really important.
And Tobirus, I'll just underline something that I heard, which is, what's our sign? Which is a manifestation of planning beforehand for the moment when you might not be able to think on your feet.
And you know, I might say, I think women in particular have been taught all of these prevention techniques throughout their lives, right? So how to keep drinks safe, where to walk, all of those kinds of things. And I would really want us to be checking in with our friends who we know are maybe get extra rowdy at parties, or we know have like hurt somebody in the past, to say like, hey, we're gonna go out to a party. I'm gonna check in with you about what your behavior looks like. Or, you know, hey, if I give you water, I think that's a sign that maybe it's been a little bit too much alcohol today, right? So thinking about not just how to have communication and signs for folks that we, you know, wanna help protect, but also how do we communicate with our friends who might cause harm?
Absolutely.
And you can also intervene with people you don't know, strangers. Yeah, that's okay and encouraged. And how does that look like in practice?
So, you know, I think one of the pieces I would say is, and Tobirus was, I think, talking about this, but if you see something that doesn't feel right, stopping to check, is this a safe place for me to intervene? Do I need to bring some friends along? Is there another person that maybe would be the better person to intervene? I think is a really good second step. And then putting that plan in motion. And so, you know, if you're at a friend's house and maybe you don't know the stranger that's doing something that's harmful, but you know the person who lives there does, maybe letting them know, hey, that thing that person is saying is really making me uncomfortable. Could you do something, right? Or it could be just going up to someone and saying, hey, that wasn't cool. Don't say that again.
And I've seen it on the streets. I've seen, you know, partners, you know, yelling and screaming at each other in a way that's very frightening, where I'm not going to step in because it doesn't feel safe, but I will pick up the phone and I'll call UCPD and I'll say, this is going on, could you check it out? We do have other resources available to us, and they're happy to respond.
And thank you for mentioning that as an example, because I think, as we've said, sexual violence does not just occur at parties, you know, and that's a perfect example of it happening outside in everyday life.
It happens in our family housing as well. We, you know, it's very close quarters, and people hear things and they don't know their neighbors and they're not comfortable. But if they just let somebody know, then somebody else will know how to get in there and intervene.
But what about a situation where there's diffusion of responsibility, where even if you say to a host of a party or to a neighbor, you know, I think something is going on, and people just kind of don't want to get involved, or maybe the host is, you know, purposefully or not ignoring you, what do you do then? I think it involves some sense of self, some greater sense of willpower. Any tips there? Any strategies?
Well,
Harder.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the first thoughts that comes to my mind is, I know that if I'm experiencing harm, or somebody I care about is experiencing harm, I want somebody else to take action, right? I want somebody else to get help and get support. And so when I think about it like that, then I think that I can be that for someone else. And so thinking about, what do I need to do to stay safe? And if I'm safe, then being able to intervene, or who else can I bring in? And just, I think it's important to assume, or to not assume that somebody else will take care of it, right? Be the leader. We're all here at Cal because we've demonstrated leadership in our lifetime, so it's a great place to continue that.
That's a great segue into ways of supporting people affected by sexual violence. Let's get into the topic of support and resources.
Yeah, so how does one support a roommate, a loved one, or a friend who has experienced sexual violence? Where do they go?
There's so many ways. So I think the first is from the heart, to be there for somebody, and to ask what they need, to help them get what they need. Not to ask too many questions, not to be intrusive, and to really believe what they're saying. Start from there and not question, well, did you do this or did you do that? It doesn't, not helpful. There are many resources at Cal to support students, and I would really encourage students to start with a confidential space, which is either Mari's office or social services at Tang or counseling center, because that's a place where students can sort out their options and really think about what do they want to do next, if anything. What they may need is medical care or emotional support, and that may be as far as they want to go. But we can also talk with them about the impact of trauma and how this may impact their ability to function as students, because concentration gets impaired and sleep gets impaired and things just get thrown askew when there's been violence. So they're prepared for that, and they have some strategies for what to do in those situations.
So part of this seminar is about alerting students to the resources and the specific people on campus. You mentioned Mari's office. Mari, I wonder if I could just take a minute to have you say the name of your office, its location, and who to talk to, maybe a website.
So I would say start with seeking a confidential care advocate at my office, and you can simply Google UC Berkeley Confidential Advocacy, and that will come up, so it's pretty easy. And it'll have a phone number, email addresses, and ways to get in touch there. And as Paula was saying, the importance or the reason behind confidential advocacy is to really allow people to make their own choice, and that's really important after an experience of violence where some people feel a loss of control or a loss of power. And so that's, for me, one of the most important pieces.
Absolutely.
And, Paula, something that you said that I really want to emphasize is when somebody discloses that they've been harmed, that can be a really brave thing to do, and it can feel really hard for people. And so if there's, 3 takeaways that you have from this conversation, it's affirm and appreciate that person for trusting you. There's something about you that they trusted enough to share something. Tell them that you're there to support them, and ask them how they can lead, and that you'll assist them in trying to secure that. And then offer them resources. There's lots of potential harm that folks can experience when they are questioned or challenged, or they feel like they're not believed or not supported. So really check in with yourself about the kinds of questions that you're asking. I think you did a really good job of there are often questions that people go to: what were you wearing? Were you drinking? Why were you there? If a question starts with why, I would encourage you to not ask it.
Back up.
Right? So really pause and think about, why are you asking this question? Is it to fulfill some curiosity or something that you need to know? Then you know what? It's not the right time. If you're asking the question because that's helping the person get the resource they need, better question. And then, to remember that people who support those who have been harmed need support themselves. So our offices are here too for friends, partners, family members. We're happy to talk with you about how to support somebody that you care about.
Additionally, how can we better support LGBTQI students and students of color on our campus who have experienced sexual violence?
That was burning in my mind just before you asked me, because I think so often the dialogue can be very heteronormative about a male and female dynamic. And a lot of the images I've seen can be white and sometimes middle or upper class, but it's so important to recognize that sexual violence impacts all communities. And when we think about, what specific identity represents for a person, it's really important to check in with how they feel impacted, especially if it was somebody in their community, and that's where it's really important to also follow how they want to proceed with it, because sometimes there's a lot of considerations about feeling ostracized from their community as a whole for coming out, which doesn't mean they shouldn't, but they need to really walk through that decision so they can find the support they need. And then I would say for, survivors of color and queer survivors, just to find a space where you will be believed, you know, and to know that if you have that feeling that something wrong happened, that to trust that, because it doesn't just happen to one group of people. And I think that happens for people to like, no, this doesn't happen in my community, does it? But it does, and so I think that's really important. I think also just related to interventions and awareness, it's really important that we partner with various communities about how they feel it would be best to reach out to their community instead of saying, okay, we're going to bring from an outsider perspective what we think you should do. But instead of really check in with people in the community and say, what feels right for you? You know, I think that's really important.
And Madi, can you elaborate what resources are available for marginalized communities on this campus?
So I would first start by saying that my office and social services, we both really spend a lot of time ensuring that we're meeting the needs of all communities. So for someone who's maybe undocumented or a person of color or queer LGBT person or someone with a disability who thinks maybe they're not going to get the support they need, know that in our areas we really care about meeting your needs there. So you know, that's one area that I'd like to start off with.
And our staffs, you know, we try to really reflect a diverse group as much as possible, but we really attune to the needs of different communities. And sometimes somebody actually wants to step outside of their community to talk about what's happened. And so I think that's the first place to start from, is ask someone, you know, in a marginalized community, what would be comfortable for you? You know, what would be best for you at this moment? And sometimes they may say, yeah, I would love to meet with a queer identified person. And sometimes they may say, well, I'm open. But just asking that question is the empowering step.
I was also going to add that all Berkeley students have insurance of some sort. So if we aren't able to meet what somebody's after, we will really work hard to connect them with someone in the community who meets the bill.
And you know, I'll add that one of the mistakes that we can make is assuming what people need. So, you know, what Tobirus was saying about asking is really important. What I might need when I need support is maybe not the same as what Paula wants or what Tobirus wants. And so to not assume that what worked for me is going to work for another person, right? And to take into account that our identities do impact our experience, our ability to heal from trauma, you know, what our family structures, what our friend groups are like, that affects our ability to heal. And so really not assuming and really supporting that person and doing what's best for them.
And also asking them what, you know, what they need from their community, if it feels safe to go back to their community and talk about this, because I've worked with students who felt like it wasn't necessarily safe. And so, you know, not only just initial intervention, but helping people broaden their social support.
So we spoke about your office, Madi, but I think we spent less time on your office and where you're located. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. My office is in the Tang Center, 2222 Bancroft Way. Our front office is room 2280. Our phone number is 642-6074.
And Tobirus, you're in that office as well, right?
Yes, yep, so they can get to both of us or other colleagues through that.
Thank you. We're out of time, but we would love to be able to give you the opportunity to provide with our viewers with that one special piece of information that you would like them to remember going forward in their college careers. Tobirus, let me start with you.
Well, I would say that it is important to always remember to practice consent, to ask, to listen, and to respect the answer that you get at every stage of your involvement with the person, because you know, consent is sexy, as some campaigns say, but it's also necessary to avoid harm.
Paula?
I think that we are in a wonderful time right now where things are really changing and that people are feeling more and more empowered, and I want people to really hold on to that and know that they can make a difference.
Thank you. Madi?
So I have two pieces of advice.
Wonderful.
One would be that there's, you know, the reporting processes, there's folks who are investigating. So if somebody comes to get support from you, you don't have to worry about being the investigator. Leave that to the professionals. Focus on supporting your friend, right? The second piece is, and speaks to what Paula was saying, is we don't all have to do everything, but we can each do something. So we can each take responsibility for doing one thing during our time at UC Berkeley. to decrease harm. And if we all take responsibility for our own actions and don't hurt other people, we could be the first campus in the US to not have sexual violence.
Knuth-Bouracee, Tobirus Newby, Paula Flamm, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. We'll see you in the next segment. Thank you.